It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind of day where the breeze carried a subtle chill, and the golden sunlight painted long shadows across the pavement. Marcus Hayes, a tall, composed man in his early 40s, stepped out of his sleek black sedan and adjusted his tie. He exuded an air of quiet confidence, his neatly pressed suit reflecting his meticulous nature. Marcus wasn't just any man. He was a highly respected officer with the Department of Homeland Security, known for his unwavering integrity and commitment to justice. But today, his calm demeanor was about to be tested in ways he couldn't have imagined. As Marcus strolled down the sidewalk toward his destination, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He glanced around, noting the bustling activity of the city. People hurried past with coffee cups in hand, phones glued to their ears, lost in their own worlds. Still, the feeling persisted, and Marcus couldn't ignore the tension building in his gut. It was a sensation he'd learned to trust during his years in the field. Something wasn't right. Meanwhile, a patrol car slowly cruised down the same street. Behind the wheel sat Officer Ethan Kramer, a man whose uniform bore the weight of authority, but whose actions often betrayed the trust it symbolized. Ethan had a reputation in the precinct, one that whispered of overstepped boundaries and questionable decisions. His sharp blue eyes scanned the crowd, but they lingered on Marcus for a beat too long. Something about the man walking with such composure irked Ethan. He didn't know Marcus, but his mind began to churn with assumptions based solely on the color of his skin. Marcus turned the corner, now only a block away from his meeting, when the shrill blare of a police siren shattered the city's rhythm. He stopped, puzzled, as the patrol car screeched to a halt beside him. Ethan stepped out, hand resting on his holstered weapon, his expression a mix of arrogance and suspicion. "You, stop right there." Ethan's voice was sharp, cutting through the murmurs of onlookers who began to gather, sensing trouble. Marcus froze, his instincts telling him to remain calm. Years of experience had taught him that even the slightest misstep in moments like these could escalate the situation. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked evenly, his voice steady but firm. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Ethan replied curtly, his gaze narrowing as he assessed Marcus's calm demeanor. In truth, there had been no description, no real reason to stop him. But Ethan wasn't about to let that stop him from asserting his authority. "I'd like to see some ID," Ethan demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Marcus, knowing the importance of de-escalation, reached into his pocket slowly, retrieving his wallet. He handed over his identification, which clearly displayed his credentials as a DHS officer. But Ethan barely glanced at the ID before dismissing it. "This could be fake," he muttered, already convinced of his own narrative. Without waiting for an explanation, he barked, "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The crowd that had gathered gasped, whispers of disbelief rippling through the onlookers. Marcus raised his hands slightly, his expression a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he began, his voice still calm but tinged with urgency. "Save it," Ethan snapped, his grip tightening on Marcus's arm as he forced him against the patrol car. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the air, a sound that sent a chill through those watching. Marcus remained composed, even as humiliation and anger simmered beneath the surface. He knew better than to resist, but he also knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the patrol car drove away, the crowd was left stunned, their murmurs fading into the background. Marcus stared out the window, his mind racing. He knew his innocence would come to light, but he also knew this encounter was a symptom of a much larger problem. His determination solidified with every passing moment. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about exposing a system that allowed such injustices to occur. Hours later, in a sterile courtroom filled with anticipation, Marcus sat at the defendant's table, his calm exterior masking the storm within. Ethan stood across the room, his confidence unwavering, certain the system would back him as it always had. But as the judge called the session to order, an air of tension filled the room. Marcus's attorney rose, holding a file that would soon change everything. As the evidence began to unfold, revealing Marcus's true identity and the baselessness of Ethan's actions, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Gasps of shock echoed as each detail came to light. Ethan's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of doubt. The courtroom leaned in, captivated, as the truth unraveled before their eyes. And just as the final, irrefutable piece of evidence was about to be revealed, the judge raised a hand, signaling a brief recess. The room erupted in whispers, the suspense palpable. Marcus sat silently, his gaze steady, knowing the moment of reckoning was near. The world would soon see the truth, and Ethan's actions would leave a stain far deeper than he had ever anticipated. The courtroom was buzzing with murmurs as people leaned toward one another, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. Some exchanged looks of disbelief, while others shook their heads, wondering how such a grave mistake could happen. Ethan stood stiffly at his side of the room, his jaw clenched and his fingers tapping nervously against his belt. For the first time, the weight of his actions was beginning to settle in, though he refused to let it show. He had always believed that the badge he wore gave him authority, but now that authority seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. Marcus, sitting at the defendant's table, remained composed, though a storm of emotions brewed beneath his calm exterior. He had spent years serving his country, risking his life to protect the very freedoms that were now being denied to him in this moment. The cuffs on his wrists had left faint red marks, a stinging reminder of the humiliation he endured earlier. He glanced at his attorney, a sharp and determined woman named Olivia, who was flipping through the file in front of her with precision. She caught his eye and gave him a small nod, a silent reassurance that she had everything under control. As the judge exited the courtroom for the recess, Marcus leaned over to Olivia and spoke in a low voice. "Do you think they'll listen? Or will this just be another case where the truth doesn't matter?" Olivia's gaze hardened. "The evidence we have is undeniable, Marcus. They'll have no choice but to listen. But whether they act on it the way they should, that's another story. Still, we're not going down without a fight." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting to the events of the past few hours. He thought about the moment Ethan had approached him, the way the officer's eyes had been filled with suspicion before a single word was exchanged. It wasn't the first time Marcus had experienced something like this, but it was the first time it had gone this far. He couldn't help but think of his father, a man who had faced his own share of injustices during his time. "Always stay composed, son," his father used to say. "People will try to strip you of your dignity, but don't let them take your integrity." Those words echoed in his mind as he watched Ethan across the room. The officer was now standing by the prosecutor, whispering something with a tight expression. Marcus wondered what was going through Ethan's mind. Did he feel any guilt, any remorse, or was he still clinging to the belief that he had done nothing wrong? The thought angered Marcus, but he quickly pushed it aside. Anger wouldn't help him now. What would help was the truth and the undeniable power of the facts. The courtroom doors opened, and a few more spectators trickled in, drawn by the whispers spreading through the courthouse. Word had gotten out that this was no ordinary case. The defendant wasn't just some random man pulled off the street. He was a high-ranking officer with the Department of Homeland Security. The revelation had added a layer of intrigue to the proceedings, and now everyone wanted to see how it would unfold. As Marcus observed the growing crowd, his mind wandered to his colleagues at DHS. Were they aware of what was happening? Had anyone come forward to vouch for him? He thought about his supervisor, Agent Peterson, a man who had always emphasized the importance of unity and trust within the department. Marcus knew Peterson wouldn't stay silent if he found out about this. He just hoped word had reached him in time. The courtroom door opened again, and this time, a tall man in a dark suit entered. Marcus's heart skipped a beat when he recognized him, Agent Peterson. The man's presence was commanding, and as he scanned the room, his eyes landed on Marcus. He gave a brief nod before taking a seat near the back, his expression unreadable. Marcus felt a surge of relief. If Peterson was here, it meant someone was taking this seriously. The judge returned to the bench, and the room fell silent once more. Olivia rose from her seat and approached the podium, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She held a folder in her hands, the contents of which she knew would be the turning point of the case. "Your Honor," Olivia began, her voice steady and firm, "we have provided evidence that not only exonerates my client, but also highlights the gross misconduct that led to his arrest. The ID my client presented at the time of the incident was genuine, and we have additional documentation from the Department of Homeland Security confirming his identity and his position within the agency. Furthermore, we have surveillance footage from nearby businesses that shows the events leading up to the arrest, which clearly demonstrate that my client was targeted without probable cause." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Olivia spoke. His confident facade was starting to crack, and Marcus could see it. The officer's gaze darted around the room, as if searching for an escape route. But there was no escaping the truth now. The prosecutor, a young man who seemed out of his depth, rose to respond. "Your Honor, while the defense may claim this was a case of misconduct, the officer in question was acting within his authority. He believed he was apprehending a suspect who matched the description of a wanted individual. May I remind the court," Olivia interjected, "that no such description was ever provided at the scene. Officer Kramer made a baseless assumption and acted on it without verifying the facts. His actions were not only unprofessional but also discriminatory." The judge raised a hand to silence the room, his expression stern. "Let's proceed with the evidence," he said. "I will not allow conjecture to overshadow the facts." The room grew tense as Olivia played the surveillance footage. The video showed Marcus walking calmly down the street, minding his own business, when Ethan's patrol car pulled up. The officer's demeanor was aggressive from the start, and his actions were clearly unwarranted. Gasps filled the room as the footage continued, showing Marcus being handcuffed and shoved into the car, despite presenting valid identification. Ethan's face paled as the video played. He shifted in his seat, his hand nervously tapping the edge of the table. The courtroom was no longer on his side, and he could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. Marcus sat silently, his eyes fixed on the screen. He could feel the stares of the spectators, but he didn't let it distract him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who had ever been wrongfully accused, every individual who had been judged not for their actions but for the color of their skin. He had a platform now, and he intended to use it. As the footage ended, the judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "We will take a short recess before continuing with closing arguments," he announced. The tension in the room was palpable as people began to file out, their whispers filling the air like static. Ethan remained seated, his head bowed slightly, as if he were finally beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. Marcus turned to Olivia, who gave him a small smile. "We're not done yet," she said, "but we're getting there." Marcus nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for justice, and he wasn't about to back down. As the courtroom emptied for the recess, Marcus stayed seated, his mind racing. He couldn't help but notice the eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with pity, and a few with quiet respect. He wasn't the kind of man who sought attention, but here he was, at the center of a situation that had become much bigger than him. This wasn't just a fight for his own name. It was a spotlight on the deep cracks in a system meant to uphold justice. Ethan sat a few rows away, still rigid and tense. The officer's earlier bravado had dissolved into uncertainty. His partner, a younger officer named Greg, had slipped in during the hearing and now sat beside him. Greg leaned in, speaking in hushed tones, his expression a mixture of concern and frustration. Marcus observed their exchange from the corner of his eye, wondering what Greg might be saying. Was it words of encouragement? Or was he confronting Ethan about the truth of what had happened? Agent Peterson approached Marcus quietly, his movements deliberate and composed. The seasoned DHS officer was a man of few words, but his presence alone carried weight. Marcus felt a sense of relief knowing Peterson was there, not just as a colleague, but as someone who understood the stakes. "Marcus," Peterson said in a low voice, taking a seat beside him, "I came as soon as I heard. This whole thing is unacceptable. I appreciate you being here, Marcus replied, "but I can't help thinking about what would have happened if I wasn't with DHS. If I'd been just another black man walking down the street." Peterson's expression darkened. "I know, and that's exactly why this needs to be addressed. Not just for you, but for everyone who's been in a similar position. We're not letting this slide." Marcus nodded, but his mind was still racing. The surveillance footage had been damning, but he knew how narratives could be twisted. He thought about the prosecutor's insistence that Ethan had acted within his authority. Marcus had seen this kind of deflection before, a desperate attempt to protect those in power, even at the expense of the truth. It wasn't enough to show what happened. The system had to acknowledge why it happened. As the recess continued, Olivia returned to the table, her phone in hand and a determined look on her face. "I just got off the phone with a journalist who's been covering cases like this," she said, her voice low but urgent. "She wants to interview you after the trial. She thinks this story could spark a bigger conversation about racial profiling and abuse of power." Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure how he felt about becoming the face of such a conversation. But before he could respond, Olivia added, "You don't have to decide now. Let's focus on getting through today." Across the room, Ethan's anxiety was growing. Greg was still whispering to him. And though Marcus couldn't hear their conversation, it was clear from Greg's expressions that he was pushing Ethan to confront something. Finally, Greg stood up and left the courtroom, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. Marcus wondered if Greg had seen something in the footage that Ethan had tried to ignore, something that had shaken his faith in his partner. The courtroom reconvened, and the atmosphere was even more charged than before. People shifted in their seats, eager to hear the next development. Olivia stood confidently, preparing to continue her argument, while the prosecutor appeared visibly flustered. "Your Honor," Olivia began, "before we proceed, I'd like to call a witness to the stand, Agent Peterson of the Department of Homeland Security. He can provide additional insight into Mr. Hayes' role within the agency and his character." The judge nodded, and Peterson approached the stand. As he was sworn in, Marcus watched closely, knowing Peterson's testimony could either solidify their case or leave room for doubt. "Agent Peterson," Olivia began, "how long have you known Marcus Hayes?" "About 10 years, Peterson replied, his voice steady. "We've worked together on several high-profile cases. Marcus is one of the most dedicated and principled officers I've ever met. And in your professional opinion, is there any doubt about the authenticity of the credentials Mr. Hayes presented during his arrest?" "None whatsoever," Peterson said firmly. "Those credentials are issued through a secure system, and there's no chance they could be forged." The prosecutor stood to cross-examine. "Agent Peterson, while your testimony supports Mr. Hayes' credibility, isn't it possible that Officer Kramer acted in good faith, believing there was a legitimate threat?" Peterson's gaze didn't waver. Good faith requires reasonable suspicion and proper verification. Neither of those things happened here. Officer Kramer's actions were based on assumptions, not evidence. The tension in the room deepened as Peterson's words hung in the air. Ethan shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. Marcus noticed the officer's gaze drop to the floor, as if he were trying to avoid the weight of the truth being spoken. As the day wore on, more pieces of evidence were introduced. Phone records showed that Ethan hadn't called in the stop to dispatch, a protocol violation that further highlighted his recklessness. Witnesses from the scene described the arrest as unnecessary and aggressive. Each revelation chipped away at Ethan's defense, leaving him increasingly isolated. Marcus couldn't help but think about the ripple effects of what was happening. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about holding people accountable and forcing a system to confront its flaws. But the battle wasn't over yet. The prosecutor was clearly grasping for ways to salvage their case, and Marcus knew they would try to twist the narrative however they could. As the court adjourned for the day, Marcus stepped outside into the cool evening air. Reporters were gathered near the steps, cameras flashing and microphones poised. Marcus hesitated, unsure if he wanted to speak, but Olivia gave him a reassuring nod, and he decided to approach. One reporter stepped forward, her expression serious. "Mr. Hayes, what do you hope comes from this case?" Marcus took a deep breath. I hope people see this for what it is, a wake-up call. No one should have to prove their humanity or their right to walk freely without fear of being targeted. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't keep happening. The reporter nodded, her camera crew capturing every word. Marcus knew the fight was far from over, but he felt a flicker of hope. People were paying attention, and as long as they were watching, he wasn't going to back down. The next morning, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The air buzzed with anticipation, the weight of unresolved questions thickening the tension in the room. People whispered to one another, speculating on how the case might unfold. Ethan entered through a side door, looking visibly more disheveled than the day before. His usual composure was gone, replaced by an unmistakable nervous energy. Marcus noticed the subtle tremor in Ethan's hands as he adjusted his tie, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if the officer regretted his actions, or if he simply feared the consequences. Marcus took his seat, his shoulders squared and his expression calm. Outwardly, he seemed unaffected, but inside, his emotions churned like a storm. He had spent much of the night replaying the events in his mind, questioning every moment, every decision, wondering if he could have done something differently to prevent the situation. But each time, he came back to the same conclusion. He hadn't done anything wrong. This wasn't his failure, it was the system's. Olivia leaned over, her voice low but firm. Today's going to be intense. They're grasping at straws, which means they might try to provoke you. Stay steady. We've got this. I know, Marcus replied, his voice even. I just want the truth to come out. The judge entered the courtroom, and the room fell silent. After the formalities, the prosecutor stood, his posture more rigid than before. It was clear he was feeling the pressure. He began by calling Ethan to the stand, a move that drew immediate attention. For the first time, Ethan would have to answer for his actions in front of everyone. Ethan walked to the stand, his steps hesitant. He took his oath, his voice wavering slightly, and sat down. The prosecutor began with carefully worded questions, attempting to paint Ethan's actions as reasonable and justifiable under the circumstances. Officer Kramer, the prosecutor began, can you explain why you initiated the stop with Mr. Hayes? Ethan cleared his throat, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I believed he matched the description of someone we were looking for, and when he didn't immediately comply, I felt it was necessary to take action. Olivia stood to cross-examine, her movements deliberate and precise. Officer Kramer, she began, her tone measured, you stated that Mr. Hayes matched the description of a suspect. Can you provide the specifics of that description? Ethan hesitated, a faint blush creeping up his neck. Well, he was wearing dark clothing, and he seemed out of place in the area. Out of place, Olivia repeated, her voice sharp. And what exactly made him out of place? Was it his clothing, or was it something else? Ethan shifted uncomfortably. It's hard to explain. It was a gut feeling. A gut feeling, Olivia said, her tone heavy with skepticism. And did this gut feeling lead you to verify his ID when he presented it to you? Did you make any effort to confirm his identity before placing him under arrest? Ethan opened his mouth to respond but faltered. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and the tension in the room grew palpable. Finally, he muttered, Hi, I didn't verify it right away. Olivia stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. So you ignored valid identification, failed to verify your assumptions, and chose to escalate the situation based solely on a gut feeling. Is that correct, Officer Kramer? Ethan didn't answer. His silence spoke louder than words. The room was electric. Every eye was on Ethan, whose confidence had crumbled entirely. Olivia turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. As Ethan stepped down, he avoided making eye contact with anyone, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his own actions. Marcus watched him return to his seat, his expression unreadable. He felt a mixture of anger and pity, anger at what Ethan had done, but pity for the man who now seemed completely lost, trapped by his own mistakes. The prosecutor called a few more witnesses in an attempt to salvage their case, but their testimonies did little to sway the court. Each statement only reinforced the narrative of misconduct and bias. Meanwhile, Olivia introduced additional evidence, character testimonials from Marcus's colleagues at DHS, commendations for his service, and even a letter from a community leader praising Marcus for his volunteer work. The stark contrast between Marcus's integrity and Ethan's recklessness couldn't have been clearer. As the day progressed, the tension in the room continued to build. People whispered among themselves, exchanging glances and quiet remarks. It was clear that the trial had reached a critical point. The evidence was damning, but the outcome still hung in the balance. Everyone was waiting for the next move, the next revelation that could tip the scales definitively. Late in the afternoon, Olivia made her way to the podium one last time. Her voice was steady, but her words carried an intensity that commanded the room's attention. This case is not just about Marcus Hayes. It's about a system that allows assumptions to override facts, that permits biases to dictate actions, and that fails to hold people accountable when those actions are proven wrong. Marcus Hayes is not on trial here. The truth is, and the truth is clear. The judge called for a recess before closing arguments, and the room emptied once more. Outside, Marcus leaned against a stone pillar, taking a moment to breathe. Olivia stood beside him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "You are incredible in there," Marcus said. "I don't know how you keep your composure." Olivia smiled faintly. "Years of practice, but honestly, it's easier when you're fighting for the right side." As they stood there, a familiar figure approached. It was Greg, Ethan's partner. He hesitated before speaking, his voice low. "Marcus, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know the full story until I saw the footage, but I should have spoken up sooner. I let Ethan lead, and I didn't question him when I should have. That's on me." Marcus studied Greg for a moment, unsure how to respond. Finally, he said, "It's not too late to do the right thing." Greg nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. "You're right. I'm going to testify. The truth deserves to be heard." As Greg walked away, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. The pieces were falling into place, but the tension remained high. The stakes were enormous, and the final moments of the trial loomed ahead, promising either justice or another bitter disappointment. As the court reconvened after the recess, a new energy filled the room. The anticipation was almost unbearable, as though everyone present could sense that the case was reaching a critical turning point. Marcus sat quietly at the defense table, his gaze steady, while Olivia rifled through her notes, preparing for what promised to be the most intense phase of the trial. Across the room, Ethan appeared even more uneasy than before. He had avoided making eye contact with Marcus all day, and now he was fidgeting, his foot tapping nervously against the floor. Just as the judge was about to call the next witness, a man in a sharp suit entered the courtroom and handed a folder to the prosecutor. The sudden interruption caught everyone off guard, and the prosecutor's expression shifted as he skimmed through the documents. His face darkened, and he rose hesitantly. "Your Honor," he began, his tone measured, "I've just received new evidence that may be relevant to this case. I request a brief recess to review it." The judge frowned but nodded. "You have 20 minutes. We'll reconvene shortly." The courtroom buzzed with speculation as people exchanged whispers, wondering what could possibly be in the folder. Marcus turned to Olivia, his voice low. "What do you think this is?" "I don't know," Olivia admitted, her brow furrowed. "But it can't be good if they're pulling this out now." When the court resumed, the prosecutor stood, his demeanor more confident than it had been all day. "Your Honor, we'd like to introduce into evidence a police report filed 6 months ago. It details a complaint against Mr. Hayes, alleging misuse of his DHS credentials in a separate incident." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Marcus's jaw tightened, and he exchanged a glance with Olivia, whose calm exterior betrayed a flicker of concern. The prosecutor continued, "This report raises questions about Mr. Hayes' credibility and the possibility that he may have leveraged his position improperly in the past." Olivia immediately rose. "Objection, Your Honor. This so-called evidence is irrelevant to the case at hand and is clearly an attempt to discredit my client." The judge considered her argument, then looked to the prosecutor. I'll allow it for now, but tread carefully. This had better be directly tied to the case. The prosecutor nodded, then turned toward Marcus. Mr. Hayes, can you explain why this complaint was filed against you? Marcus took a deep breath, his voice calm but firm. I'm aware of the complaint, and it was investigated thoroughly. The allegations were found to be baseless, and the case was closed. This has nothing to do with what happened during my arrest. The prosecutor smirked slightly, as though he had been expecting the response. And yet, isn't it true that you used your DHS credentials to enter a restricted area during that incident? An area where you had no official business. No, Marcus said firmly. I was there as part of a sanctioned operation. The misunderstanding was cleared up. Olivia stepped in quickly, her voice cutting through the prosecutor's line of questioning. Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to distract from the real issue. Unless the prosecution can demonstrate a direct connection between this report and my client's arrest, this line of questioning should be dismissed. The judge nodded. Sustained. Move on, counselor. But the damage was done. The courtroom murmured with renewed speculation, and Marcus could feel the weight of doubt settling over him like a heavy cloak. Olivia leaned in, her voice a whisper. They're trying to shake you. Don't let them. As the proceedings continued, Greg was called to the stand. He walked to the front of the room with purpose, his expression determined. Marcus watched closely, unsure of what Greg would say. The officer had claimed he wanted to tell the truth, but Marcus knew how difficult it could be to stand up to a system that prioritized loyalty over accountability. Greg took his oath and sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The prosecutor began with routine questions, but it was clear that Greg's testimony wasn't going the way they had hoped. He spoke candidly about the events leading up to Marcus's arrest, admitting that he had reservations about Ethan's actions, but had failed to voice them at the time. I was wrong to stay silent, Greg said, his voice steady. What happened to Mr. Hayes was unacceptable. He showed us his credentials, and we ignored them. Ethan ignored them. The prosecutor attempted to redirect, pressing Greg on his loyalty to his partner and his department. But Greg didn't waver. Loyalty doesn't mean turning a blind eye to wrongdoing. Marcus Hayes didn't deserve what happened to him, and I won't be part of covering it up. The courtroom was stunned. Even Olivia seemed momentarily taken aback by the strength of Greg's testimony. Marcus felt a flicker of gratitude for the man who had finally chosen to do the right thing, despite the potential consequences. But just as Greg stepped down, the prosecutor stood once more. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to recall Officer Kramer to the stand. The room erupted in whispers. Ethan hesitated, his face pale, but he had no choice but to comply. As he took the stand again, the tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point. Ethan looked visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the witness stand. Officer Kramer, the prosecutor began, you've heard your partner's testimony. Do you agree with his assessment of the situation? Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting to Greg, then to the judge, and finally to Marcus. The silence was deafening, every second stretching into an eternity. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake, he said, his words halting and uncertain. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. The courtroom was in chaos, the revelation sending shockwaves through everyone present. Ethan's admission was unexpected, a crack in the facade that had held the case together. But even as the truth began to emerge, Marcus knew the battle wasn't over. The stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome remained uncertain. All he could do was hope that the system, flawed as it was, would finally deliver the justice he deserved. The courtroom sat in a tense silence, the weight of Ethan's admission hanging heavy in the air. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had frozen, the collective gaze of the room fixed on the shaken officer. The judge leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable, as though measuring the impact of Ethan's words. Olivia stood, her voice calm but edged with intensity. Your Honor, with Officer Kramer's testimony, it is abundantly clear that my client was the victim of not only wrongful arrest, but also the misuse of power fueled by bias. At this point, it's undeniable that Marcus Hayes complied fully, presented valid identification, and was treated unjustly. The case against him has no merit. The prosecutor rose, clearly scrambling to regain control of the narrative. Your Honor, while Officer Kramer has acknowledged mistakes in judgment, it doesn't negate the fact that Mr. Hayes' behavior during the encounter. Before he could finish, Marcus stood abruptly. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the prosecutor's argument. Your Honor, I'd like to address the court. Olivia shot him a concerned look, but Marcus met her gaze with quiet determination. The judge hesitated for a moment before nodding. Proceed, Mr. Hayes. Marcus turned to face the room, his broad shoulders squared, and his voice steady. I've spent my life serving this country, protecting its citizens and upholding the law. When I was stopped that night, I knew I had done nothing wrong, and I believed that the truth would protect me. But what I didn't realize was how easily that truth could be ignored when assumptions and prejudice take its place. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been judged before they've been heard, treated as guilty without cause. I hope today is a step toward accountability, not just for me, but for everyone. The courtroom was silent, his words resonating deeply. Even the prosecutor seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The judge cleared her throat and glanced at the attorneys. Are there any further arguments? Olivia shook her head. No, Your Honor, the defense rests. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. This court has heard a great deal of testimony and reviewed substantial evidence. It is clear that the actions taken by the arresting officer were not only inappropriate, but also a violation of Mr. Hayes' rights. The charges against Marcus Hayes are hereby dismissed. The room erupted in a mixture of applause and murmurs. Marcus exhaled deeply, relief washing over him as Olivia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of justice, as though a massive weight had been lifted from his chest. But just as the courtroom began to settle, the unexpected twist came. A man in a dark suit entered the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. He approached the bench, whispered something to the judge, and handed her a document. The judge's expression shifted from confusion to shock, and she turned to the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I have just been made aware of new information, she said, her tone cautious. It seems this case has wider implications than we initially understood. The man in the suit turned to Marcus. Mr. Hayes, I'm Agent Turner with the Department of Justice. During the investigation, we uncovered evidence of a much larger issue involving systemic misconduct within the precinct responsible for your arrest. Officer Kramer's actions that night were not isolated incidents. The room collectively gasped. Even Olivia looked surprised. Agent Turner continued, his voice firm. There are records of falsified reports, excessive force, and incidents of racial profiling that stretch back years. This trial has brought these issues to light, and an independent investigation has been launched. Marcus stared at the agent, his mind racing. The personal injustice he had endured was painful enough, but the revelation of a deeper, systemic problem was staggering. He glanced at Ethan, who now looked utterly defeated, his head bowed low. The judge addressed the court again. This trial may have concluded, but it appears we are only at the beginning of addressing these larger issues. The court commends Mr. Hayes for his bravery in standing up to this injustice, and I hope it inspires change where it is desperately needed. As the court adjourned, Marcus walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, his heart heavy but hopeful. Olivia stood beside him, her expression a mix of pride and determination. You did it, Marcus. You stood your ground, and now real change might happen. He nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. It's a start, but there's still so much work to be done. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the twists and turns of the past few days. The injustice he had faced had been painful, but it had also exposed a truth that needed to be reckoned with. And while the fight was far from over, he knew he wasn't alone. The road ahead would be long, but Marcus was ready to face it head-on, determined to ensure that his story would be a catalyst for change.